Well, if you've been watching this channel, you know I'm a big Who fan. I haven't talked about them as much. I did a review of Quadrophenia a long time ago. I think my videos are a little better than they were at that time, but I did do a review of Quadrophenia, which is such a good album. I also did a review the other night of Alison Rouse, who was the young lady. She called herself a groupie, so I'll call her that too, but very nice young lady and a very interesting person to speak to. And she was there, of course, when John Entwistle died. And I've done a couple other things on The Who, but not much. But I've always been a big Who fan. And I picked up this book by Roger Daltrey, Mr. Kibblewhite. Thank you. Thank You, Mr. Kibblewhite, which is his autobiography. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his background a little later in the video, but just to preface the title, Mr. Kibblewhite was the school authority figure who expelled Mr. Daltrey from school and said, "You're never going to make anything of your life." And of course, Roger Daltrey went on to be a multi-millionaire, one of the most famous men in music, and maybe one of the most a really great figure. Now I read that and I thought, Mr. Kibblewhite, that might be kind of a one of these how do you like me now type situations, kind of like that Toby Keith song, How Do You Like Me Now, where he's driving around in limousines and playing to big stadiums full of people, and he's kind of taunting this girl that used to reject his amorous advances. How do you like me now? You didn't know I was going to be this big shot country star. And I thought maybe that's what the title was implying, kind of a screw you, Mr. Kibblewhite, I did it my way. But I'm not sure that that's really what he meant. He actually doesn't talk about Mr. Kibblewhite. I thought maybe Mr. Kibblewhite would be this kind of significant figure in the book, but he's really just kind of mentioned in passing. But it's interesting that he made that the title, and that must have made a mark on him, that this guy, he was about 15 at the time, and he was being kicked out of school for smoking, and then he was involved in some kind of air gun accident where a kid lost his eye, one of his eyes, or vision in one of his eyes, and he was kicked out of school. And Mr. Kibblewhite said, "Mr. Daltrey, you're never going to amount to anything." And I guess that's the kind of thing that a lot of people would just piss a lot of people off, and I'm sure it did Roger Daltrey. But when I actually saw him say something about that on an interview one time, and I had the impression it was more than that he saw this as a time in his life where this had happened to him. He got kicked out of school, and I think he still passed his exams, his 11 plus or whatever they call it in England. But anyway, his school was kind of over. But he made something out of his life, and in a way, I think he might look back on it, I don't know, I can't speak for him, but as a kind of sobering moment where he realized, whatever I do, I've got to work my ass off. I can still be, fun and all this, but he kind of started to work hard in whatever he was doing, and kind of turned his life around. So I don't know if he would be entirely negative about Mr. Kibblewhite. I thought maybe it would be the list of rock and roll stars who have had run-ins with school authority figures. Leonard Skinner, I think, was a gym coach. The list could go on, but I think it was a little more complicated than that. But anyway, he named the book Mr. Kibblewhite, and it's an interesting read. Well, one of the first things I wanted to say that I think is evident in this book is Roger Daltrey is a good musician. And I mean, that seems obvious in a way, but I guess I just wanted to point out that sometimes I think when we see lead singers, we don't always realize that they're musicians. The good ones are, and I think I've been playing a long time. I've definitely sung with people who were good singers, good entertainers but weren't good musicians. I mean, I've sung with, you know, a lot of different people, and I've definitely sung with some people who are good singers but not good musicians. But a lot of the singers, I think, that have been around for decades are also good musicians, you know. And it's funny, I think they kind of they find something that works for the band, which is having them out front, if they're, you know, good looking and they can work a crowd and all that. And then pretty soon people don't necessarily think of them as good musicians. But, you know, Mick Jagger's a good musician. And a lot of times these guys wouldn't necessarily be the you know, a flashy hot shot lead guitar player or something. They might be, but a lot of times they're good musical people that understand songs and, you know, can play good rhythm guitar. I was thinking Mick Jagger plays the harmonica. You know, Steven Tyler was a good drummer. Karen Carpenter was a good drummer. Who else was like that? There are a bunch of people. I've always thought that's kind of one of the issues with Robert Plant's solo career, is he's always kind of looking for other people to play with, because I don't think he plays music well enough himself to really have a standalone solo career. I shouldn't say that. I hope he's not watching this. As much as I like and respect Robert Plant, but to be a good musician, Roger Daltrey was a good musician, and kind of like Mick Jagger, you ever see him play the harmonica? That reminds you that he started out as a good musician. He was also a good guitar player. Now, again, he wasn't flashy. He was probably never going to be a lead guitar player, but he was a good musical rhythm guitar player, and he had a good background in all those blues songs. And he kind of goes through a lot of that in here. Like, he really liked Elvis. I think Heartbreak Hotel was one of the first songs he ever played, and he built a guitar out of plywood, he says in here. That's pretty interesting. He kind of goes through some of the saga of having lousy guitars and, you know, tying string. He said if a string broke and it was in a part of the guitar neck where they could fix it, they'd tie it together like a shoestring and, you know, keep playing or something because they were so broke. And they spent a lot of money on cigarettes, kind of a classic rock and roll background. But he was a good musician, and he had a good background. He said he was really influenced by Lonnie Donegan. Now, that's a guy that's come up with Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page. I've seen a number of sort of those British invasion era stars mention him, and I don't think he's well known to a lot of Americans, or maybe a lot of younger people in general. But he talks about Lonnie Donegan doing like a song called Cumberland Gap on British TV. And so Roger Daltrey was a good musician with a good background in songs. And they did a lot of like kind of blues songs. They did some country type stuff, kind of like the Stones, I think, or the Beatles even in those early days. And that changed when Pete Townsend started writing all those good songs, and they became more of a distinct band with its own original catalog, which of course was a great thing. But before that, you had Roger Daltrey, and he was actually kind of the rhythm guitar man, almost like you'd see. Elvis was another one who was actually he could play like rhythm guitar pretty well. To like do a lot of those Elvis type songs. And I think Roger Daltrey was kind of like that. So he's a good musician, and I think that's such an important point that. You'd say that about Mick Jagger and so many of these people, Rod Stewart. They're good musicians. You know, they're not the flashy ones. What happened is they found their calling was to be out front. You know, not holding a guitar, but they'd be out there singing, and that's what worked. But if you go back into their background, they were good musicians. And I think along with Roger Daltrey being a good musician, the other thing I kind of wanted to talk about was his background in Shepherd's Bush, which I think is a neighborhood in London. And of course, one of the things I always think about when I think about Roger Daltrey in those years is sort of the myth of Roger Daltrey, which is sort of the elephant in the room. That myth is that he's this tough guy. You know, there are very few rock and rollers that are more of a tough guy than Roger Daltrey, you know, and he was... if he punched you, he'd break your jaw, and he was, real macho, kind of hard ass, and that's sort of his myth. And I remember they used to kind of play that up on some of their old album covers, like Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy. Looked like he was kind of the neighborhood tough kid on the cover there. I was pretty interested in that because, I don't know, that's just, ever since I've been listening to The Who, which is 40 years now, that's sort of been the part of the image of Roger Daltrey. He actually does talk about that a little bit. You know, he said that actually when he was a kid, he would be bullied a lot. He was raised around some pretty tough neighborhoods, and he would be bullied a lot, and he learned to fight back. So his version of it is that he was never the bully, that he was really just an easygoing guy, and other people would pick on him, and he would kick their ass, and he would hit them first, which is a good fighting strategy, get the first punch in, but then pretty soon people started calling him a bully when actually he was never the one starting all these fights. That's his version of it. But anyway, he did do his share of fighting. That's sort of, at least there's like a lot of myths, there's an element of truth there. He also talks about like some of the shenanigans they would do, which probably today we wouldn't do. I remember when I was a kid, you know, I think a lot of us at one time or another were either in the room or were on the receiving end of things like swirlies, wedgies. This is all kind of maybe like 12-year-old behavior for boys. I know I was in summer camp once, and every boy in our cabin received a wedgie, and I remember my wedgie. And I was also in the room once when a swirly was administered, and I received a swirly once. So yeah, there's some things like that in there. I don't know, but that is kind of part of the mystique of Roger Daltrey, is he was a tough guy, and he does talk about that a little bit. But you know, when you really get past that, there's some of those stories in the book that kind of get your attention. But really, when you read the book, you find a decent, easygoing, kind-hearted man who has a life full of meaningful friendships, and his parents loved him, and he had lifelong friends. And I think that's the real Roger Daltrey. So the fact that he kind of learned to defend himself when he was 14 maybe lives on in a kind of notoriety, but that's not the real Roger Daltrey. I guess it doesn't hurt to have that somewhere in your credentials. If necessary, I can kick somebody's ass, but that really wasn't when you read the book, that's sort of in there. And so I think he was sort of almost expected to tell some of those stories, and then apparently they're true. The other thing Roger Daltrey talks about that I thought was kind of interesting, that again goes to his early years, is his relationship with school. And I thought that was so interesting because so many of these rockers have bad relationships with school. And I've thought about that in a more serious way the older I've gotten, and I thought about it again reading this book. Here you have people like John Lennon, hated school. Roger Waters, wrote all those nasty songs about schoolmasters. Ray Davies, the Kinks, Schoolboys in Disgrace. Not to mention kind of the juvenile delinquent hatred of school you see in like Alice Cooper, School's Out, Brownsville Station, Smoking in the Boys' Room, Van Halen, Hots for Teacher. We could go on and on with all the sort of rebellious songs about school, but sometimes in a more serious way. School can be stifling. It can be a straitjacket, especially sometimes for some of these alpha guys, really, that are so smart, so creative, have so much energy and drive and independence and freedom of mind. And school really can be a straitjacket. And I'm always careful with that, because you don't want to come across like you're cutting down school or telling everyone to drop out. That would be foolish. But it is a cautionary note about how much emphasis we place on school. When you look at, these are some of the great artists of the last 200 years, and so many of them hated their school experience. And I do think it's sort of true that schools become so institutional particularly in the 20th century, maybe even more now than when Roger Daltrey went to school. But certainly it's so institutional. Roger Daltrey talks about how much he hated choir. Now here you think about it, here's a guy that's got a great voice, so much obvious talent. He's got one of the most recognizable voices in the world. He's sung so many great songs, and he hated choir. Now why is that? You know, it wasn't just because he was some free spirit and wanted to do his own thing, but you know, he talks about this middle school teacher, you know, and I just pictured or what in America we would call middle school teacher. I guess I just pictured like some of the choir directors I've known. They want you to sing vowels and from your diaphragm, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. I've had some wonderful choir directors too, and I love choir. So I hope I'm being careful, but you do kind of get that sense sometimes, and I think it's a cautionary note about how much emphasis we put on school. And you look at all these great individuals that have done so much in the arts and creativity who hated school, you know. And Roger Daltrey was always caught smoking, and you know, and always in trouble kind of in school. But it's kind of a cautionary tale, and it's certainly one you can think of so many examples like that, really. One thing about the book, Roger Daltrey doesn't spend a whole lot of time going through the music of The Who. Once he gets famous, I always think, you know, it's kind of, when I read several of these books, once they got famous, I sort of felt like, in a way, it was stuff I knew, although there was always a lot more detail. You know, they would talk about agents and people behind the scenes, so that's always interesting. To me, it's always more interesting to read about their background, especially when they come from such interesting backgrounds like post-war England, Dr. John, New Orleans. That's a really interesting background. Levon Helm, Arkansas. But when he does get to The Who, one thing I wish he would have spent a little more time, you know, going through some of the albums and the songs. And in this song we did this, and we recorded it this way, and I sang it this way, and we did 100 takes, and you know, and I tried it this way, and I tried it that way, and Pete's guitar was this, and then they redid it with that. And he doesn't do much of that, which is always kind of interesting if you like the music. He didn't say all that much about, like, to me, Quadrophenia, which is one of the best albums I've ever heard in my whole life. And Pete Townsend wrote it, but Roger Daltrey's voice was critical. He talks about it almost as part of the narrative of other stuff that was going on at the time. So I wish he'd maybe spent a little more time on the music. But that said, it's very interesting, and you do get the really good, early stuff. Later parts of the book are pretty interesting. Towards the end of the book, now this book came out in not that long ago, and the end of the book you have like John Entwistle's death. He talks about Keith Moon's death. And we had Alison Rouse on the channel the other day, and he talks a little bit about Alison Rouse's. He doesn't say her by name, but he does call her a nice lady. He said John Entwistle was with a nice lady, and he died in Las Vegas in a hotel room. And he's called her a nice lady. Now, you might know that when John Entwistle first died, Roger Daltrey made the famous quip, "Hookers and blow, what a way to go," kind of referring to what he perceived to be Alison Rouse's job, and also, you know, some of the partying that was going on right before Entwistle's death. He even says in here he's a little more toned down. He wasn't kind of making dark jokes about it, but he does kind of say that's how John Entwistle would have wanted to go. Any rocker would want to go like that, but the timing was horrible and he was too young. He kind of says that, but anyway, it was interesting. But when he gets to the Who stuff, it's interesting, but to me it's not as interesting as those early sections. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoy the book. I do recommend it. And, you know, Roger Daltrey is such an important figure, such a great artist. But that would be my takeaway. He's a good musician. He's not just a good singer. He's a good musician. He's had a very interesting, long life. He is a tough guy. He comes from, he had to work for what he had, and sometimes he had to fight his way through, but literally and figuratively. And he to me, he's always been kind of an epitome of, someone with the kind of masculine energy that I find very attractive, which is, a lot of testosterone, a lot of masculinity, but also the tenderness and warmth that of manhood. I guess he kind of has a lot of that. I feel that, but just a great artist. I think that kind of he can pull off a song that is tough, but he kind of gives you his heart when he sings it too, and that's a hard combination, And what a great voice, he really comes out when he sings. And when you read this book, you really get a sense of his life, and what an interesting background that he does have. So I do recommend the book. Well, thanks. God bless you.